in order to develop fully and maintain their physical and mental faculties. Society today already possesses sufficient resources. The point, and I'm not going to get conspiracy theory here, is that the world can sustain, given its abundance, the food security demands, at least for the population at hand now, right? Already possesses sufficient resources, organizational ability, and technology, and hence the competency to achieve this objective, global food security. Accordingly, the eradication of hunger is a common objective of all the countries of the international community, especially of the developed countries and others in a position to help. Right? So the whole point is, the goal is to achieve global food. Right? The goal is to achieve global food security. Right? That's the goal. The goal is to achieve global food security. There is a sense in which we can achieve global food security, but you have to recognize the tension. For me, I think this goal is in direct opposition to, and maybe even in a worst case scenario, it fails to recognize the problems that are created between the expansion of global capitalism and the demands, the severity of the demands of the global emerging markets for cash crops. And that idea of satisfying the demand is going to trump the individual community of indigenous people and their right to consumption crops, right? If I go and I say I have X number of dollars and I'm waving it to the farmers, and the farmers recognize that, wow, I can make money, I can do what I need to do, and so on. And of course there's a lot of gender issues here, right? Because I'm sure, and this is a bit of a generalization, but I've done enough research on the topic to know that typically the men are going to sort of be in charge of the land, but it's going to be a lot of, especially in Africa, but it's going to be the women that actually farm the land. So the men get the money, they run off, they do whatever they do with the money. The women are then obligated to transition the crops from consumption to cash crops. The crops are gone, the land becomes increasingly fallow, and what happens? Well, it eventually becomes fallow, and people's families are destroyed, and communities have to leave, and people, in worst case scenario, end up suffering from malnutrition and starvation because their land wasn't properly used. The point is, there is an expectation, there is a demand, but that demand has to be directed towards the emerging market demand. And really and truly, what this boils down to, for approaches that we can help, is that you have to be, as a consumer, me as a consumer, I drink coffee, I'm not going to lie, I drink coffee, I eat rice, we need these things. They are products that sustain our lives. Well, rice is, in a sense. Coffee, you don't really need it per se. But, so you need to make sure that the coffee that you get has been grown and has been cultivated with this in mind, right? That the manufacturers of this coffee recognize that they're not wholesale going to just envelope all of the land in a particular area, grow coffee all on a particular area, that some of that land is left for the farmers and the indigenous populations in order to farm consumption crops for themselves. Right? Because if everything around them in their vicinity is used as cash crops, then the inability to properly rotate the crops will lead to any number of problems, including the malnutrition and inevitable starvation of the population. And the idea that global capitalism is going to sit back after having invested, no one's holding a gun to anyone's head, after having invested in crops, invested in farmers, and then try to sort of repair the damage. No, it moves on for new fertile lands, and the process continues, right? So it's up to us as consumers to make sure that we understand where our products come from, how our products were grown and procured, and to make sure that if we're going to buy coffee, if we're going to buy rice, if we're going to buy, you fill in the blank, corn, wheat, whatever, that it was grown with sort of this consciousness in mind, right? We don't want to contribute to the exploitation of those who have no other options. Number 2, the World Food Security, World Food Summit, November 13th through the 17th of 1996. The Rome Declaration on Food Security says the following, quote, "We pledge our political will and our common and natural commitment to achieve food security for all," right? The attempt is to achieve food security for all, and obviously we're talking about the goal being global, right? The goal is global, right? So again, we pledge our political will and our common and national commitment to achieving food security for all, and to an ongoing effort to eradicate hunger in all countries, right? That's a pretty lofty goal, right? To not only achieve food security, but to eradicate food hunger globally. It's a huge goal. With an immediate view to reducing the number of undernourished people to half their present level no later than 2015, right? So very rapidly, that date is approaching. And I don't know specifically what the numbers were at the time that this was written, but the goal is to reduce that number by half, right? So there are half the amount of people starving from 1996 to 2015 that were starving, undernourished, malnourished in 1996, that number would be reduced to half by 2015. It would be interesting to see where they are right now. I didn't go into that level of sort of analysis to see if they're on track for meeting that expectation of sort of a twofold reduction, but lofty goal nonetheless. And then finally, number 3, so we'll just put reduction here, and this process is gradual. And then finally, number 3, the connection between the following: food security supplies, human rights to those supplies, and the government obligation to provide access to those supplies, right? So what I wanted to do to explain 3 is to show you what happens when the government is specifically put itself, when the government has specifically put itself in a position to, and actually I'll lose my tie bit. The government has specifically put itself in a position to exploit the needs of those who most need food to survive, right? If there is a right to food, and the government has the obligation to prevent, and not only a right to food, but a right to be free from starvation, sort of articulated in this first generation sense, then we need to look at what happens when the government exploits their obligation. And specifically, this is, I mean, tons have been written on this, so I'm not necessarily contributing anything new. All that I'm doing, hopefully, is really grounding the violation of food as a human right in a historical example, so that you see just how important it is that we recognize food as a human right, because it is the strategic attempt to use and weaponize starvation that we see arguably one of the greatest violations of human rights. I mean, it's not to say one violation of human right is better than another or worse than another. It's a ridiculous claim to make. But that how successfully genocidal orchestrators can orchestrate mass extermination via mass starvation. So let's look at Stalin's mass starvation of the Ukraine, right? And he targeted the population as such, but specifically he targeted kulaks, which were independent farmers who had a little stash for themselves, right? They had a little bit, they had a land, they were able to have a bit reserves for themselves, and they were able to sustain their lives, but not only their lives, they might have had a little bit more for members of their community. If your attempt is to starve the population, and there's members in sort of real general sense, there's members of the population that have reserves, then insofar as they have reserves, that's going to undermine your attempt to starve off the population. So we need to target the people who have reserves. That's the idea, right? Find out other people who have reserves. Let's target them hard. Then we force the population to meet a ridiculous quota that cannot be met, right, as far as rations are concerned. And eventually we will exterminate the population. So how does this look, sort of the forced starvation of a community? Well, what you need is a very regimented, in this sense, socialist in its most taboo sense. And I don't want all the, the anti or the defenders of socialism. It's not a critique. It's just a very centralized government, right? Under the banner of equality, accessibility of food for all. And you have portions of the population which have been targeted for extermination, right? So this portion of